The Last Voyage of the Demeter made my list of top 10 most anticipated films for 2023. So, did it meet my expectations? Not really. So, I'll say right off the bat about this movie, The Last Voyage of the Demeter. It's not awful. I didn't hate it. I just felt a bit underwhelmed by it, and I wasn't expecting that. I figured I would either really, really like it or I would hate it and it would just be something so awful, but I didn't expect sort of a type of feeling from it when I came away from it. I'll start off by trying to encapsulate the different pros to this movie. It's very atmospheric. It's very dark. It's also, it's got a depth of emotion to it that not all horror movies have, and I appreciated certain aspects about that. There was a quote that one of the characters said in there. I think it was the Onion Knight. It was, is his name Liam Cunningham? He played the captain on here. I believe it was him. So these two, they were having sort of a round table type of discussion at the start of the voyage. And he was trying to find, he was just talking to the people. And this main character, oh my gosh, what was his name? I forgot his name, y'all. He was a doctor. And he made his way on the voyage. So they're having this discussion, and he was saying that because the captain was asking, I will get into some mild spoilers, but nothing's super huge. But this isn't super spoilery. This is just a quote I liked. The captain was asking the people on the crew, what were they going to do with the money that they made when they got to the port or whatever. And the doctor guy was saying what he wanted, money couldn't buy him. And he went on to explain that he wants to understand the world. There are things in the world he doesn't understand. There has to be an answer to certain things, and that's what he wants. He wants to get it. And the captain said something along the lines of, I wasn't able to write it down completely, but it was something along the lines of, perhaps the world is not meant to be understood, but experienced and accepted. And I like that. I like that bit of dialogue between them. Sometimes there's quotes, even if I'm not super crazy about a movie, even if I'm not super crazy about a movie, sometimes there will be quotes that I just personally find very profound, and I appreciate the meaning behind it. And that was one of them. Something else I liked about this movie. Oh, Chibi, despite what you're seeing in these pictures here, in the beginning, especially when the creature is seen, he's very much in the shadows. They don't show his face fully, and even when you do see his face more fully, it doesn't linger on him, which I think is a good thing. I was watching a reviewer, I think it was Chris Stuckman, and he was talking about how it looked like there was a mixture of practical and visual effects, I guess, with regard to the creature, and I that's true. I think when he's flying through the air, that's visual, and then there's very clearly other parts where he's practical. The character design was interesting. He is a true monster in this movie. There's nothing suave or romantic or Gary Oldman about him at all. But this is also part of its con for me. And it's weird because I like the character design. I thought he was sufficiently creepy and scary, but there were parts of that bleed into con territory, which I'll touch on when I get to it. I also liked that now this movie is about 2 hours long. There's no post credits. I looked it up before I watched the film. I think it's like 2 hours and 8, 5, 10, whatever. It's less than 2 hours and 10 or 15 minutes long. It takes its time. You get introduced to the characters, then the voyage starts, and it's about 40 minutes before the first human kill. So it doesn't jump into the horror right away. It builds itself up, and then once they realize they're being picked off one by one, something sinister is aboard, and it becomes this all-out battle for survival. Now, this movie, as I've mentioned before, is based on a chapter from Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is basically just a series of captain's logs about what happened on the Demeter. So the Demeter is the ship that Dracula is transported on from his home country. He wants to go to England. And the Demeter is the ship that he travels on. I've already said that, repetitive. But when it makes its way, well, when it comes ashore, it's empty, it's derelict, there's nobody there. So you as the reader or the listener of the book, if you happen to listen to the audiobook, Sound Booth Theater did a version of Dracula, it's excellent. When you listen to that, and that was actually the first time I ever heard the story. I never wanted to read it because I really am not super crazy about books from way back when, 100 plus years ago, 50, 60, 70 plus years ago, not super crazy about it. But I worked on the audiobook and I loved it so much. So the reader or the listener assumes or deduces that Dracula he's killed everybody on the ship. So this tells the story of what happens to everybody on the ship. So you know going into it, this is not going to have a happy ending for most, if not all, of the people on board. I like the whole idea of this story. I find it interesting. We've never really seen, I think we've seen bits and pieces of, I guess, what happens on the ship in Dracula movies or whatever, but never really a movie that focuses on this part of it. And I liked it. I was immediately drawn to it when I found out about it late last year. I didn't find out about it till I was just searching for movies to add to my most anticipated films of 2023 and found out about this. I was like, oh, that's cool. I like that. So that just from the start is a pro for me. And also the way this movie was filmed, the cinematography was decent. The director, his name is Andre Overdahl. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but he has done things we've probably all know of, especially horror fans. He's done The Autopsy of Jane Doe, which I've seen. He did Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which I've seen. I liked both of those. I wasn't super crazy about them. They're okay. He's a competent director is my point. And he did a decent job here. I liked also just the horror aspect of these people being picked off one by one and me trying to guess who was going to be the next one. And some of my predictions were accurate and some of them were not accurate. That's also a pro for me, that there was something specific that happened in here that I wasn't expecting. And I was like, oh, wow, they went there with this. And so I appreciated that kind of caught me by surprise. So cons. Dracula, I'll tie back directly to what I was saying about him being a true monster here. So, and how that was a pro, but also part of it was a con. So he's this feral type of creature. And because of that, he's coming across like someone who, so, in Dracula, he presents himself as human. He's this creature. I guess maybe his origins were that he was human. And so he would have the mind of a man. He's not just only a monster. But in this movie, he comes across more as a creature, just a creature. And I know that's what Dracula is, but what I'm saying is you're not seeing much human side to him at all. So he's not necessarily coming across as a creature or a horror character that's actually making smart choices in what he's doing. And someone made the point that, well, he's been aboard this ship for weeks. He's starving. Okay, I get that. And he's going to be more feral looking in nature. I get that, because in the books he's not. Doesn't really look, don't really know what he looks like, but he looks like a man. But after he has fed on a few people, you would think that feral nature, that just pure creature nature part of him would kind of fade away and be more overtaken by the higher logic, higher brain part of his character. And he never really came across that way, unfortunately. So that was a little bit, I was having trouble kind of reconciling my thoughts about that. And that's why his character design, the scary nature of what he looks like is a pro, but also that part of him is a con in different ways as well. And tying around to that, sometimes his kills made no sense. Like, I didn't understand why he killed some people and not others. some of that just didn't really make much sense to me. And then sometimes he would just appear to be in these random places here so he could attack and kill this person over here. And then he's in this room here, and I don't know. That felt a little bit choppy to me when things like that were happening. Oh, okay, it's time for this person to die. Let's show them they're just randomly alone. After a while, it took him a bit to realize, yeah, let's not be alone. But then still he figured out ways to get to people despite the fact that they weren't supposed to be alone. Sometimes they still ended up being alone. Anyway, whatever. Another con to this was audio issues with this movie. And I don't know if this was just maybe my theater. Maybe they were having some issues with the speakers or whatever, but sometimes it was hard to hear what they were saying. Sometimes they were very overpowered there was a lot of storms and rain and terrible just waves and crashing and just very loud, boomy noises. And sometimes the voices were overpowered by that. Or maybe, like I said, it was just the audio system in the theater. Maybe there was an issue. So that was a little bit frustrating because I would miss sometimes what people would say. Another thing that's kind of in con-ish territory, not really, this is more kind of like neutral territory, the acting. I was watching Chris Stuckman's review and he was raving about the acting. He thought it was just excellent. It was so good. And it was good, but it was not anything that absolutely blew me away. Everybody did fine, but there was really no standout performance for me. And some of the characters, like the character of the woman, some of her lines and some of her interactions with the other characters, it didn't work so well for me. And I can't really put my finger on why, because it wasn't that she just did a terrible job, but maybe it was just the dialogue. Maybe the dialogue just wasn't working for some of her lines. She was fine as far as the acting, but like I said, nobody was this big standout. And I consider that kind of a con, but to be fair, it's not really, because nobody in here was terrible. The weakest link in here was probably the little boy. Even though he did a better job than the little boy in Haunted Mansion, there were still parts that I didn't feel like he did the best at. There was also a weird scene with him, like it's showing him, and I'm wondering if this was an edit mistake or a screw up on his part and then they just didn't notice it and edit it out. But there's a scene where he's somewhere by himself and he's aware of this scary, dangerous situation that's going on. And when the camera pans on his face, he has this little grin, like an actual grin. And I was like, oh, what's funny? What's making him smile? And then his face changed and it got like he wasn't smiling anymore. And I was like, that was really weird. That looked like an edit mistake. Like they forgot to take out, like maybe before he was getting ready to do his part, something kind of tickled him and he had this look on his face. It didn't match with the scene and it really stood out because I wrote it down. Kid smiling. What? That was just odd. And then another thing that was a con was when they're talking to this girl and she is telling them about this creature because she knows what he is. And when she reveals his name, when she says his name, and he's this legendary, iconic character, when she reveals his name or says, Dracula, it felt so anticlimactic. She just said his name and they moved right on to the next line. It felt like we needed a little bit more punch to that line, and it was just almost felt like a throwaway type of, I don't know. That didn't work for me either. Another thing that got on my nerves was there's a scene in here where the kid is told to stay in a room, lock the door. Kid does not. He leaves, gets in trouble, some terrible stuff happens. Okay, I guess this is the nature of kids. It can be the nature of kids. But it was so predictable that he would do something like that, and he did something like that, and that was aggravating. Anyway, I apparently there's a kid in the Meg 2 who does something like this as well. Lisa Loves mentioned it in her review about how that really aggravates her, and it aggravates me too. It aggravates me when adults do it. Though sometimes adults do it because sometimes it can be done in a way that works out okay and it makes sense. But then a lot of times it's just like, oh my gosh, this dumb person doing this. Like, why would you? Whatever. I'm getting ranty, but that was also something that ended up in the con territory. And then there's a scene where someone is banging to get into a room, banging this door. And I'm thinking to myself, nobody's hearing this noise, but they can hear when someone bangs on the walls. That was weird to me. That didn't make sense. And then coming towards the end of my cons, I didn't feel a great level of attachment to these characters. And I don't know if that was just because, like I said, the acting was just, it was okay. It just didn't draw me in like I was hoping that it would have. Maybe that's why. Or maybe it's just the way the script is written. For whatever reason, I was not super attached really to anybody in here. Maybe the dog. And that didn't help. That's probably why I feel kind of underwhelmed by it, because I didn't have this deep connection with characters like you should have in order to fully appreciate a story, especially a story like this. Like, I felt very attached to the character in Talk to Me. I didn't feel that way really about most of the characters in here, even though they did an adequate job at portraying their characters. Unfortunately, that connection just was not there. And something that I read about this film was that apparently it spent 2 decades in development. It had a lot of script rewrites and recasting. And when I read that, it made me wonder if, so the main character, the doctor, more and more, especially these days, like maybe 20, 30 years ago, it wouldn't have come across this way. But more and more, it feels like certain characters are put into movies with the intent of being able to let us know how bad certain people were to other certain people a long time ago, even still today. And so it feels like there's some messaging that's going on when things like that happen. And there were moments here and there where that was touched on. And I was like, okay, so obviously the time that it's taking place in, definitely a feasible type of scenario. But because this is something that they did with a character in a movie today, that felt a bit like it was veering into messaging territory. It wasn't something that was hugely overt. It wasn't smacking you over the face, but I noticed it. I picked up on it because it just feels like that's more and more a thing in movies. They have to make sure to get a little bit preachy to you about stuff. And that grates on my nerves. Feels like, oh, it's 2023. We got to have some virtue signaling and let everybody know these sorts of things. So there was that aspect to it. That wasn't a huge thing, but it was definitely something that I noticed. And when I read that there had been rewrites and recasting, I was like, I wonder if, so as the progression of the development of this movie goes on and on and on, 20 years ago, probably had a whole different sort of feel to it and everything. And then we're going more and more into the 2010s, getting into the 2020s. And there's definitely this very aggressive type of approach to these sorts of things in movies and shows. And I was like, yeah, I'm wondering if that was part of the whole rewriting and all that stuff. So there was that. And finally, I'll kind of try to wrap my thoughts about this up by paraphrasing or repeating something that I saw in a written review of this. They said that this movie had the potential to become something distinct and interesting. And I agree, it did. Because like I said, I like the premise, the idea, great. But ultimately, in the end, it falls short of what it's like. It's right there on the edge, but it just can't. It just doesn't. So that's why I just felt kind of... Anyway, I don't want these sentiments to make you guys think that this movie isn't worth anybody's time and that it was terrible, because it wasn't. I think I'm just frustrated that it wasn't. And I didn't go into it with huge expectations. I mean, I was hoping it's good and I'm excited. I'm looking forward to it. One of my top 10 most anticipated. But having said that, I still was like, oh, okay, we'll see. But still, it didn't, I guess it didn't match the expectation that I felt was warranted, given the fact that this was a movie that was in my top 10 most anticipated. I don't regret watching it. I wasn't mad at it. I like I said, I didn't hate it. I just was underwhelmed. And that was not an expectation I had when I went in to see it. Okay, well, if you guys get a chance to watch it, let me know what you think. It just feels like there's just something missing to give it that spark. And I don't think I'm the only one who noticed that about this. After I was reading the reviews, I'm like, okay, so yeah, someone even called it dull. I wouldn't necessarily call it dull. I mean, I guess you could say meh would mean it's dull. It didn't feel dull. It just didn't have the spark. I think that's it. I don't have anything else. I've gone on much longer than I anticipated, so I am wrapping this up. I've got quite a bit of editing I know I'll need to do later.